Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the second panel for today. My name is Miley Arvin, and I am co-director of Pacific Island Studies at the University of Utah. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this event in our Spring Symposium series. I am speaking to you from my home in Salt Lake City. And for those of you who may be only listening instead of viewing the screen, I am a light-skinned Native Hawaiian woman with dark hair in my 30s. And my Zoom background image shows an aerial photo of the Salt Lake Valley with some buildings of the University of Utah campus visible in the foreground and the Wasatch Mountains in the background, with a border of a red Pacifica patterned Block U logo that represents our Pacific Island Studies program here at the University of Utah. So this image of the beautiful land here reminds me to begin by sharing the Indigenous land acknowledgement written for the University of Utah. We acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many Indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. So I hope our words here today, though focused on Pacific Islanders, remain in good relation with the Ute, Shoshone, Paiute, and Goshute peoples. And thank you to Dean Catherine Stockton for her support, as well as our funders, the Mellon Foundation and the University of Utah's Global Learning Across the Disciplines grant from the Office of Global Engagement. This series, Pedagogies for Indigeneity and Diaspora, Pacific Studies at Home and Abroad, brings together a number of teachers, activists, and community leaders to talk about what it means to teach Pacific studies in the current moment. In the pandemic-fueled shift to online teaching and conferencing, what are the pedagogies, both old and new, that Pacific Islander scholars, activists, teachers, and performers are drawing on to educate and foster knowledge relevant to Pacific Islander people? This panel is the second of four panels happening today and tomorrow, and following from a launch panel on March 18th. Throughout the symposium, we take special inspiration from the work of the late scholar and poet Teresia Tewa. Her work, which so creatively transgressed disciplinary boundaries, continues to offer a vibrant model of teaching Pacific studies at home and abroad. The title of our panel today, We Sweat and Cry Saltwater So We Know That the Ocean is Really in Our Blood, like the titles of all the panels in the symposium, are quotes from her work. Within the broad topic of Pacific Island Studies, Pedagogies for Indigeneity and Diaspora, this panel focuses specifically on issues of the environment. So the structure for the panel will be, our moderator will introduce the panelists, and then each of them will have about 10 minutes to present and discuss their work. Then there'll be some time for panelists to dialogue before opening it up to questions from the audience. So please feel free to add questions to the Q&A box during the event. We will select as many as we can within the allotted time for panelists to answer after their presentations and dialogue. Also, please note that we have live captioning available during this event. To enable it on most Zoom platforms, you can look for the CC or closed captioning button on the menu of the meeting controls at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And simply click on that button to view the captions. Some viewers may also need to select Show Subtitle after clicking the CC button. In the chat, our team will be sharing some links to some related Pacific Islander programs and opportunities, and I'll just say a bit more about those at the end of our panel. But the links are there for you now. And with that, I'll introduce you to the moderator for today's panel, Makaio Kimbrough, who is currently a master's student here at the University of Utah in Environmental Humanities. Makaio worked for the Ministry of Primary Industries in Aotearoa as an intelligence agent during the Banamia, Austria parasite outbreak in 2017. He then graduated from Utah State University in 2018 with his BA in International Studies with an emphasis in environmental science. He then completed a graduate degree in GIS, Geographic Information Systems, in 2019, and then was accepted into the Environmental Humanities program here at the University of Utah. His thesis focuses on looking at environmental injustices through the lens of the Pacific. And we just heard he's going to be defending it pretty soon. His special talent is that he can eat 15 musubis in one sitting. So I'll turn it over to you. Mahalo, Makaio.
Thank you for the introduction, Miley. I'm also coming to you today from my home, Gokarni, the Eastern Shoshone name for the place we now call Salt Lake City. So as Miley said, our panel today is titled, "We Sweat and Cry Saltwater," so that we know that the ocean is really in our blood. So we also have some fantastic panelists with us today. Fabulous, absolutely fabulous. So first off, we have Leilani Chan. She is the founding artistic director of TeAda Productions, a nomadic theater of color based in Los Angeles. Leilani is currently the co-chair of the National Asian American Theater Conference and Festival, and is to be held in Hawaii in May 2022. TeAda's Master of the Currents premiered in 2017 at the Honolulu Theater for Youth and toured to Maui Arts and Cultural Center, University of Hawaii Hilo, Brava Theater Center, and Pangea World Theater. The 2019-2020 Santa Monica Artist Fellowship and Awards include NEFA's National Theater Project, MAP Fund, NEA, NET, 4 NPN Creation Funds, and 2019-2020 Santa Monica Artist Fellowship. Leilani's devised ensemble plays include Global Taxi Driver and Refugee Nation. Our next panelist is Innocenta Sound Kikku. She is a community leader in Hawaii. She's originally from the beautiful island of Leilani in Truk State, Federal States of Micronesia. She has over 10 years of law enforcement, and she is an active advocate, storyteller, interpreter, teacher, and cultural navigator with a particular passion for women and children. Ino is a founder of the intergenerational youth program Pacific Voices at Kekuakalihi Valley, KKV, and is vice chair of the Micronesian Health Advisory Coalition. She plays a key role in connecting community to resources and cultural support and advocates for their rights to health and culture. Our next panelist is Tammy Tabe. She is a Pacific Islands anthropologist who has worked widely in the Pacific Islands, and she specifically worked in the Solomon Islands, Fiji, Tuvalu, and Kiribati, and she's also worked on marine protected areas, ecosystem-based adaptation and gender equality, historical relocations of Pacific Islands people, identity and diaspora, and climate change-induced migration and displacement. She received her master's degree in Pacific Island Studies from the University of Hawaii, Manoa, and her doctorate of philosophy and social anthropology from the University of Bergen in 2016. She currently works as a lecturer at the Pacific Center for Environment and Sustainable Development at the University of the South Pacific in Fiji. Her current research interests focus on historical relocations of Pacific Island populations, and how these cases can inform decisions and policies for future migration of Pacific Islands due to climate change. The notion of migration as an adaptation strategy to climate change and migration as displacement of Pacific Islanders, and the role of social capital in affecting the reestablishment and continuity of Pacific Islands communities, who are likely to be displaced by climate change in the future. Then the panelists that we're starting first with, but also introducing last, is Dr. Olivia Quitanilla. She recently defended her dissertation entitled Inafa Maluk, Restoring Balance to Resilience, Resistance, and Coral Reefs, a study of Pacific Island climate justice and the right to nature, in the Department of Ethnic Studies at UC San Diego. Olivia's family is from Wuhan, and she's used her academic art opportunities as a Chamorro scholar to research the unique histories and futures of Pacific Island life. She is interested in climate justice, marine justice, Pacific underwater ecology, and coral reef activism. She served on the board of directors for Chamorro Hands in Education Links Unity, CHELU, and she teaches Chicanx history at Mesa Community College, and she also teaches environmental racism at UC San Diego. It is my pleasure to welcome each of our panelists today, and I'll turn it over to Olivia to start with. Thank you, Olivia.
Thank you so much for organizing everything and for these very kind introductions. So thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you for this opportunity to be part of such an exciting conversation. Today, I'd like to share some of my reflections on how I engage with the environment with our Pacific Island diasporic students in San Diego, California. So for me, teaching about environmental justice and providing students with opportunities to reflect on their own relationships to the environment is a really critical entry point for students to explore their ethnic identity and ethnic identity development. Something that's been really integral to my development as a human being, as a scholar, and really coming into a healthy and loving relationship with my own Pacific Island identity. So our ethnic identities are influenced by media, by literature, current events, and information that's passed down from one generation to the next. Ethnic identity development is important for all people, but especially for Pacific Islander diasporas. Ethnic identity development is about exploring, understanding, and proudly claiming the complex dimensions of the self that may instill feelings of belonging and identification to a particular group, those shared commitments and values, and it can also spark a sense of belonging to a particular place or island, whether or not someone has physically ever been to that particular location before. For Pacific Islander youth, ethnic identity development plays an even bigger role because as they experience the dominant culture, their ethnic identity might go unexamined or unexplored. And then that person transitions to adulthood without ever really forming a positive sense of their ethnic identity or of self. And there is such thing as a negative ethnic identity, right? Or feeling bad or poorly about what your culture is and where you come from. So I can speak to this because without exploring my own ethnic identity growing up, I felt like I didn't belong, didn't really have a strong sense of self or culture. And it wasn't until I explored my own ethnic identity through the environment that I had a stronger sense of self. So I argue that ethnic identity development is connected to environmental practice, to environmental beliefs and behaviors. In my own journey to understand and grow my ethnic identity was fueled by the values passed down to me by my Chamorro grandmother and my mother, values derived from my grandmother and grandfather's Chamorro culture and lifetime of experience growing up on Guam, nurturing the land, living off the land, and living with a sense of reciprocity and balance when it came to the environment and natural resources. So I was raised learning from their stories of island life, living on the coast, their connection to ocean and to animals that truly set the foundation and the framework for the respect that I now have for interspecies harmony and the honor that I hold for the environment of all scales today. So when Pacifica students access their ethnic identity through the environment, oftentimes it's Indigenous Pacific Island values of reciprocity, of interspecies harmony, of sustainability, and I mean real sustainability and ethical natural resource management that they end up exploring and connecting with. And then they can apply that to their own lives, no matter where they live in the world. So these kinds of connections and explorations spark positive relationships to the environment all over our planet. And it provides a meaningful way for our Pacific Islander diaspora to learn and care for the environment wherever they are, and at the same time develop positive feelings about their Pacific Island ethnic identity. So I currently teach history for the Chicano Studies Department at San Diego Mesa College, Community College, and I teach environmental racism at UC San Diego. So my students span all ages, all backgrounds, and all interests. But what most of my students do share is a hunger to actively search for meaning of their own ethnicity and culture, no matter what age they are. This kind of exploration can transpire in many ways, but what I find most meaningful is involving research about their ethnic group's history, learning the language, and participating in cultural activities. What I like to do is invite my students to assess their own relationship to their environment, their knowledge about the environment. Where do their environmental beliefs, their practices, and environmental priorities come from? How does their relationship to the environment differ from that of their ancestors? What can we learn from the changes in those relationships across time? And what can we learn about the changes to the environment itself over time? What about the changes in the relationship between how they relate to the environment compared to their ancestors, their grandparents, their parents, and thinking about the future generations? What changes? When I teach about environmental racism and justice, I highlight how the stakes are high for Pacific Islanders to develop positive ethnic identities, because for some Pacific Islands facing militarization, environmental violence, and violence against animals, marine animals, and climate change, our homelands are under threat and face irreversible damage. And the cultures we are working so hard to learn about, to connect with, to preserve, to pass on, are cultures that are so tied to and inspired by specific island places and ecosystems. They might look a little different or a lot different in a few years if current threats continue to transpire and escalate. When our Pacific Islander students in the diaspora feel a sense of belonging to their home islands, even if they never had the resources to go home yet, they can work towards positive change in their current location and an awareness to support efforts to protect the environment their ancestors called home. My own Chamorro values and connections to the environment led me to explore my ethnic identity through an environmental lens. And this exploration led me to learn more about my culture and home islands in ways that grew my relationship to the environment and were inspired by my Chamorro ancestors' lifeways. I look forward to finding more creative ways to engage the environment with our Pacific Island diaspora, because I find it so important, so meaningful for our future generations. And I would love to collaborate with this beautiful community that you have brought together here to grow the spirit of work. Thank you for listening. Thank you for having me.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Olivia. That was awesome. Okay, so next up we have Leilani and Ino. Please welcome them as they share their experiences.
Aloha, aloha kako. My name is Leilani Chan. I am based right now in Los Angeles, the home of the Tongva, land of the indigenous people. And I was born and raised in Hawaii, so I travel back and forth to Hawaii as much as I possibly can, except for, of course, this year during the pandemic. It's been the longest I've been away from home in a while. Mama Ina, do you want to introduce yourself and say where you're calling from?
Yes, I'm Innocenta Sound Kikku. My community, or you'd always call me Mama Ino. I am calling in or tuning in from Honolulu, Hawaii. I want to give honor to the Kanaka Maoris of this land. I am on the Aupua of Kaleo Opalena in Kalihi, and I'm 52 years old. I can't believe it. And I am brown skin, and beginning to have white hair.
Oh, thank you. And I am 51. No, wait, I'm 50 years old. I turned 51 this year. And since you divulged your age, I was born and raised in Hawaii, but I am not Kanaka Maoli or Pacific Islander. I run a theater company called TeAda Productions. Most of my roots and spirit reach towards Hawaii, and the name of our company is called TeAda, but you can pronounce it any way you want to pronounce it. It's a Spanglish Ebonics way of speaking, and since I'm from Hawaii, I say, oh, you like go to the TeAda, because Pidgin Creole of Hawaii is my first language. And we have been, my partner, Ova Salpang, and I run the company from Los Angeles, but we travel all over. The purpose of our company is to tell the stories of people of color who are not represented in mainstream media or main stage theaters. What our work is called these days is devised ensemble practice. And my partner, Ova Salpang, was raised in Kalihi Valley. And we went back home to Hawaii about 10 years ago or something. And after having just developed a piece about Laotian refugees in the US, and we met Mama Ino through some other mutual friends, and the experiences that Mama Ino was telling us about what was going on in the Micronesian community seemed to echo a lot of what was going on in the Laotian community right after the Vietnam War for Southeast Asians. And we just felt that we wanted to kokua and give back to Hawaii and see if we could help the community tell these stories through theater, because that is where we are based. And I wanted to hand it over to you, Ino, as we, it took us a long time to get the project started, but you really made it possible for us to do the work by doing the protocol in the community before we even started. I guess I want to ask you, do you want to say something about that and why you felt it was important that we do this project?
Yes. Thank you very much, Leilani. I just want to thank Olivia for setting the groundwork of what to speak about. And truly, what you've touched is really the reason why we do what we do. I also run an after-school program, which is called Pacific Voices, and we uplift our protocols, who we are, our ancestors, our land, our ocean, and one another, and how that relationship is so important. That relationship grounds us and takes us to places that we couldn't even imagine that we will be able to find our similarities and our identities. And in working with Master of the Current and sharing of our culture with Leilani and Ova, and bringing up what is so valuable and important of who we are, and then putting it on stage and making it available for everybody to share was magical for me. And I just want to say that I cannot say enough mahalo or kilisosapur, and thank you very much to our elders who grounds us in reminding us that the importance of our identity. So when Tamanapoli Otoko share, we used to be masters of the Pacific Ocean, but today we are slaves to the currency of United States. It touches my heart in so many levels. And I also see the struggle of how the next generation are not equipped enough to really be grounded and move forward because of their identity that is being lost. And so hoping that there is a way to continue to uplift our culture in a sense that it doesn't make us be the forgotten group. You know, we were the new kids on the block 10 years ago, trying to find our places. We face a lot of discrimination, racism, and how much more was it for our youth that they really struggled the hardest until today. As a matter of fact, not too long ago, just 2 days ago or a day ago, something happened within our community. I'm not gonna go into it too much because I'm gonna be a basket case. But the fact that we are able to bring our story on stage, and Leilani and Ova helped us to, you know, do all these ensembles and bringing to life what is of our culture and of our reality to stage is very valuable and important to tell our story, that we share the same similarity of what our environment and what our needs to continue to grow together. So thank you, Leila.
Mahalo. And just as a quick, I'll try to be quick. Master's Occurrence is the name of the play that we created with the help of, with guidance really, of Mama Ino. We call her our cultural navigator. And in our practice, we really try to decolonize our theater practice. So from the very first workshops, even though we were coming in as the theater people, I wanted to make sure that we, that all of the folks participating and sharing their stories felt empowered, and that they were there as experts as much as we were. And throughout, it took us about 3 years of doing workshops in Hawaii and doing community sharings where we just had everybody who worked with us on stage. We had a couple community sharings of that were like at least 30 performers on stage with us. And then by the time we were able to create a 5-person play that premiered at the Honolulu Theater for Youth, we were able to cast 4 out of 5 cast members were from the Hawaii Micronesian community. And of those cast members, they've now not only performed in a 3-week professional production when we premiered at Honolulu Theater for Youth, we performed that for over 3,000 students, and that schools were bussed in to see the play. And then we were able to tour it inter-island to Maui and Hilo. And we also then toured it to San Francisco and Minneapolis. And we were supposed to be in Utah right now, but because of the pandemic, the live performance has been postponed. Hopefully, crossing fingers that we can be in person in Utah in November, and then continue to tour the work, giving opportunities to our cast members to be able to tour, connect with community and the diaspora wherever we go. We even connected with a community in Minnesota, thanks to Professor Vince and Tina, who are at the University of Minnesota. They connected us with Vince Diaz affectionately calls the Melanesians, who live in Milan, Minnesota, and they live like in the middle of Minnesota. So it's like 3-hour drive from Minneapolis, and we were able to connect with them and have them do workshops with us and see the show. And to kind of try to sum it up really quickly, we everything that Professor Olivia Quitanilla just talked about is certainly one of our goals and outcomes from doing the performances. And in the performances, you know, we heard a lot about the bullying that was going on in the schools against Micronesians, to the point where when we first started the workshops with high school youth, some of the students at the beginning of the workshop, they wouldn't even identify as Micronesian. It wasn't until at the end of the workshop, when we gained enough trust, that the students were willing to come and say, yes, they were Micronesian, but of course they were much more passionate about identifying by their specific ethnicity, whether it was Chuukese or Kosraean or Marshallese. And those are the stories that we gathered and wove together a play. And one of the things that Innocenta pointed out to me in a recent conversation is we even put a funeral in the production. And the reason being that what I learned was that the funerals were a place to pass on traditions and cultures and cultural practices to the next generation. And there was a lot of misunderstanding by the teachers, knowing that the students were getting pulled out by their family so often to attend these funerals. And it's a combination of the fact that so many Micronesians are in Hawaii because of health issues, that they have to be in Hawaii and they had to leave their islands. And on top of that, the funerals as a cultural practice. And so that is actually in our production. And what stands out to me is that this was even before the pandemic. On adding to that, because I have so much respect for Mama Ino and the work she does as a community organizer. She is on the front line of, since the beginning of the pandemic, how the Micronesian community has been targeted in Hawaii is still relevant in our play. And I don't want to put you on the spot, Mama Ino, but I just learned so much from that practice, and it just makes me so worried for the community right now during the pandemic, being targeted, being blamed, but also so many Indigenous communities, those who are passing might be the last ones holding the language of that community and the last one to practice those cultural practices. So this is an ongoing concern that I am aware of, and with recent incidents in Hawaii, it's only compounding that. So I'll wrap it up. We have more to discuss, but I am so honored to be here with all of you. Mama Ino, any last words?
I think we run out of our time, but mahalo and thank you for the space and for having us. We cannot thank you enough.
Perfect. Thank you both. I love the idea of theater and how it marries talking about complex issues, especially environmental and racial issues. And I'm so excited for November. So I'll keep my fingers crossed, but all of the yes. So then, last but not least, we have Tammy. Tammy, if you please come on.
Hi, everyone, and a very good morning from Suva, Fiji. I'm right here in my office. I had an early start because I had to be by the foreshore today to discuss some issues. We're having a trigger regatta tomorrow, so we were just trying to get the team together and discuss some of the issues with regards to who's sitting in which seat in the canoe. And so it was really interesting because for the first time I found myself this year, especially in this era of the pandemic, really sitting by the ocean and just observing the sunrise and contesting over who's sitting in the front seat in the canoe and who's going to be steering. And it just reminds me of, the ocean itself and just the theme of this symposium today about how the ocean can also be a contested space. But not only that, but even being in the waka itself can bring about this kind of issues. So I am very grateful to be part of this symposium. And thank you for all those who have linked in to listen to this panel. Thank you for just setting the stage, especially Olivia, TeAda Productions, and I thought I was not the last, but apparently I'm the last. So I'll do my best to keep you interested and keep you informed of what I'll be presenting today. So today I really want to just briefly talk about what I'm doing in terms of my research and work, and how it all came about, and some of the rediscovery of me, not only as a Pacific Island scholar, but also as a descendant of a relocated community in the Pacific. So I'm just going to share about how it all started, and how I came to institution. So when I first started, I never realized that my family was relocated from the Gilbert Islands. And I think there's a map that shows the relocation routes. If I can ask Miley to. Yeah, so it all started when I left the Solomon Islands. So growing up in Solomon Islands, my grandparents never really talk about the relocation or how we ended up in the Solomon Islands. We were obviously different because, as you can see, I'm not dark. And so if I say I'm from the Solomon Islands, people often raise their eyebrows and say, like, are you sure? Are you not Samoan or Tongan? And, you know, like identifying people through their physical appearance is really important in the Pacific. And it's often sort of like the go-to answer if people are asking you where you're from. And so it was never an issue in the Solomon Islands growing up. But I knew that I never really hear anything about the relocation history to the Solomon Islands, so how we ended up there. We were identified as Gilbertese people. Today, a lot of people often call us Ikiribus. And we got that identity of being Gilbertese people from the colonial naming of the Gilbert Islands. And then now Gilbert Islands is now part of Kiribati. So we were always known as Gilbertese people. And then I moved to Fiji to study, and that's when I started having identity issues, because when I was asked, like, where are you from? And I say, I'm from the Solomon Islands. People often ask me, why aren't you Black? And like, it's very offending, like, to say that I'm from the Solomon Islands, but apparently I'm not Black. But what was also challenging was not being able to explain where I originally came from, because I was never informed or being told about the relocation history of the Gilbertese people to the Solomon Islands. So I was sort of like constructing this different identities. So I would find myself with Niueans, and it was just easy to be identified with that group. And I started hanging out with Samoans, and it was just so easy to be identified as one of them. And not until I went to Hawaii to study when I discovered that it's so important to know your identity, especially your ethnic identity, your cultural identity. And Hawaii was a space where identities are constantly being contested. And it was such a great space for me to really rediscover myself, my identity. And it was in Hawaii that I was encouraged to really look into the history of the relocation of the Gilbertese people to the Solomon Islands. And so that's where I first started my journey. It was a very painful journey because I thought, like, if my grandparents didn't tell me about this, then why should I go and dig it up? But I had really good mentors that really guided me throughout this journey and really allowed me to rediscover myself as a Gilbertese. So today I want to just speak to you not only as a Pacific Island scholar, but as a Gilbertese. I've got Tuvaluan lineage. I'm a citizen of Solomon Islands, and I currently live in Fiji. Yeah, so in the 1960s, the Gilbertese people were relocated. In the 1950s and 60s, they were relocated to the Solomon Islands, first to the Phoenix Islands, which is part of Kiribati today, as a result of land shortages. And then the second relocation to the Solomon Islands was a result of what the colonial administration saw as extensive period of droughts. So they thought, oh, you know, the solution to this would be to relocate them from the Phoenix Islands to the Solomon Islands so that they can have a better livelihood. And so they were relocated. So at the time, people didn't really have anything to say. They just followed orders. So when I went back in Hawaii, to try and sort of dig up the past, I realized that there was only few documentation of the relocation, but most of it was documented by people that were actually involved in planning or administering the relocation. So I was told to like go back to the Solomon Islands to visit the Gilbertese communities and actually ask them what really happened. So in the Solomon Islands, we can go to the next slide. There are two main settlements during the relocation, the first initial relocation. There was a group of people that first settled in Titiana, in Gizo, and then my grandparents settled in Wagina, where we still live today. So I went back to these two communities and discovered that they never really had anything, any say in their relocation to the Solomon Islands. And it was basically, they were basically silenced. And it was really sad for me because when I went back, a lot of the elderly people said to me, like, we've been waiting for this long for someone from our own community to come and ask us about our history, their relocation history to Solomon Islands. And so I really was honored to be able to sit down with them and really learn from them about the whole historical sort of story about the relocation. And it made me realize that there were two different stories, one from what was documented by the colonial officers, and then one was the story of the Gilbertese themselves about the entire relocation. And it was sort of like two contradictory stories. And so that's where I started my research, not to dismiss what the colonial officers have written and documented about the relocation history, and not to disregard what the Gilbertese settlers said about the relocation, but to bring two stories together and present them so that people like me and the generation later can understand why we ended up in the Solomon Islands. And so today we have integrated and become very much part of the Solomon Islands. We've expanded in terms of communities. We've got several communities across the Solomon Islands, but not only that, but beyond that, we've got diasporic communities in New Zealand and in Australia and even beyond Oceania. And so I want to just refocus, take us back to what I'm doing today. So I'm currently teaching climate change adaptation at the university, and with emphasis on climate change, migration, and displacement. And if you have been within this space, you would know that there's so much that has been researched, documented, and shared on climate change impacts in the Pacific Islands, as well as on migration and displacement. There is a lot of this discussion often focused mainly on climate change adaptation. How can Pacific Islands overcome or adapt to climate change impacts? And if you're involved in international or regional spaces, there's often that push from Pacific Island countries to be heard, to be heard in terms of decision makings, and to be honored, especially in their plea for the reduction of the global carbon emissions. However, like within these discourses, while there's a lot of emphasis on migration as a climate change adaptation, very little focus has been on displacement, especially this whole notion of displacement of Pacific Islands as a result of climate change and extreme events. And we often wonder why people don't want to talk about displacement, especially when you're trying to inform national policies as well as frameworks that have been developed and sort of like intended to be implemented in the Pacific and in various communities in the region. And I realized, not only as someone who's been involved in that space and is contributing towards decision making through my work and also policies, I realized that a lot of the narratives and discussions on climate change adaptations have been imposed on us in the Pacific, and we've taken it on and run with it. So basically everything's been mainstreamed in climate change adaptation, has been mainstreamed in decision makings, even in our conversations from day to day, that Pacific Island countries are vulnerable because we are small, we have small economies, we don't have a lot of infrastructures, we are very isolated from each other, we are very dependent on the natural environment and natural resources. And it really made me think, like, is this what I want to be speaking about? Is this what I want to be advocating about as a Pacific Islander? I think there's more to being vulnerable as a Pacific Islander or Pacific Islands to climate change. And I realized that over this past years, I've been advocating for the same things. So Pacific Islands are very vulnerable to climate change and they need to be relocated as an adaptation strategy. And I never really take a step back to sort of like reflect on what is my story, what am I narrating as a Pacific Islander? And I only realized that recently, like just last year, when I took a step back and really said, like, I felt like I lost my voice. I lost my standing as a Pacific Islander, as a Pacific woman, as a person who came from a relocated community. Like, what am I saying? Like, what am I advocating here? And I realized that as Pacific Islanders, we don't often ask questions. We never ask questions. We either take things as they are and then discuss them later in a small groups, or just never say anything, even though we disagree or not. And I realized that maybe if we turn things around, then maybe we could be heard more, or we could be seen instead of being invisible, even if you're in a meeting around a table that you're talking about important things that really concern people's lives in the Pacific Islands. So for me, I started asking these questions. It's really hard questions. And I think it's really important because we often don't ask hard questions. And if you're in a space where you're constantly working on developing policies for communities, we usually avoid hard questions that really require emotions and people, people's relationship. And so I started asking questions because I wanted to see that, when we ask hard questions, it's going to help inform solutions and way forward, especially when we talk about climate change, migration and displacement. So I started to highlight, like, it is really important to talk about the positive and negative implications of migration and displacement, especially in the Pacific, so that potential challenges can be avoided and minimized. And to also realize that for Pacific Islanders, there is a fear of loss, loss of land, loss of identity, and of being displaced. But there is also this agency, the agency to fight, to be heard, to be seen, and to also do our best to remain in our homelands. We have a lot of examples of relocated and displaced communities in the past during the colonial period, and a lot of lessons can be learned from that. But I think one of the things, like Myla mentioned in her opening, that, what does it mean to teach, as a Pacific Islander, Pacific Studies, wherever you are? And I think for me, my question is, what does it mean to ask questions, especially about climate change, migration, and displacement as a Pacific Islander, especially in this contemporary space? And so I've got a few questions that I just want to pose for all the listeners out there, and maybe it'll inform some of the work that you do, or maybe you have some thoughts about it. I'll be more than happy to hear from you. But I guess one of the things that I've been asking during discussions on climate change is climate change migration a solution or displacement for Pacific Islands and its people? Because I think that if we agree to climate change migration, then it really gives us little incentive and effort to put towards reducing global carbon emissions. And if we do not agree to climate change adaptation or migration as a solution and see it as a displacement, then it gives us more to do to be able to fight so that people from the Pacific or from these vulnerable countries can remain in their islands. Also, how is displacement defined or perceived and embodied by Pacific Islanders? What does it mean to be displaced for Pacific Island people? And finally, how can Pacific diasporic communities around the globe inform the discourses or research on climate change, migration, and displacement? So I'll stop there. I think my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tammy. So I'm going to be cheating a little bit since I'm the moderator. You get to ask my questions first. So I actually have a question for you, Tammy. How does displacement differ from migration? Because there's an interesting tension that I've been kind of developing as I was listening to your talk, and I was just kind of wondering if you could explain that relationship a little bit more, please.
All right. So thank you, thank you, Makaio, for your question. I think that's also being continuously being unpacked here in the Pacific, because there's a lot of concepts that have been developed and imposed as part of discussion on climate change here. When we talk about migration, so migration is often seen as it can be voluntary or forced. And so if it depends on migration, this migration can take place at the individual level as well as the household level. So when it's voluntary, it does not really affect you personally because it's your choice to move or it's your family's choice to move. And I think a lot of that is happening in the Pacific where people migrate overseas to be with their families, to get a job, to go to study, and then just leave and create a diaspora community outside of the Pacific region. And then you have one that you're being forced. But however, that sort of forced migration is now being perceived as relocation. And so when we talk about relocation, you're looking more at a community level. So like the whole relocation of an entire community rather than just an individual and household. This becomes more complicated. And I think that's one of the issues that is being talked about and discussed here in the Pacific, especially for atoll nations like Kiribati, Tuvalu, and Marshall Islands, where a whole group of people or communities can be displaced as a result of climate change.
Thank you. That actually brings up this really interesting tension that I've developed through my research, or for my thesis, actually. So, actually, lost my train of thought. Anyways, a common theme between all of the presentations has been a connection between identity and how that has kind of shaped your interactions with the environment. How has identity shaped how you all approach environmental injustices? Because each of the stories that were shared today all take part or fight against or call to action against environmental injustices in some way, shape, or form, I feel. So all of us are, environmental activists. So kind of how has identity shaped that relationship between all of us? If you could all answer, please.
I think I would just say that in the general community around being an environmental activist, I think is perceived as, stop polluting and reuse, reduce, recycle, and that it's something that's going to happen far away. And I think in doing this work, what I really want audiences of our work to understand is that climate change looks like migration. It looks like people coming from another place into new places, and what happens there, how you treat the people, how you treat newcomers. It's important to understand that you might be that person next, because if we don't stop climate change, we're all going to have to relocate, migrate, whether it's forced or not. And those are some of the issues I try to bring up in the play and hope that the audience leaves talking about what happens when we have to move, when we're displaced because of climate change. And for me, it's understanding that that communities of color, Indigenous communities are the first ones that are already being hit by climate change. And I'm so thankful to the other speakers. You both of you really were very clear on that.
I can jump in. I love this question. Thank you. So I feel like my identity shapes my teaching and my practices with my students. And the way that that's really exciting is a lot of my students are different majors. I get a lot of STEM folks, engineers, all kinds of students with diverse interests, right? So my identity shapes the priorities that I have in terms of what readings I want to share, what areas of the world I want to focus on, and how I want to expose students to different kinds of environmental justice issues, and how I'm able to really inspire them to take whatever path they're interested in, right? If they're going to be sitting at tables with tech people or with engineer folks, like wherever they're going to go, I get to shape some of the questions that they're going to bring to those tables, or at least some of the framing that they're going to have. So I think it's a big responsibility that I have when I approach environmental justice in that way. And some folks might get a little discouraged if they don't have, students that are aligned with the major that they are trained in or teach. So when I get folks who are not ethnic studies majors, I see that as a really exciting challenge. And I think that's where a lot of the growth comes in. So I see my identity as shaping the future in really exciting ways with non-ethnic studies or non-environmental studies majors.
Can I just add on to that? I think one of the things that I've been approaching recently here at the university is really like questioning like what makes us who we are as a Pacific Islander. And often we when you talk about climate change, is often approached from a human sort of centered approach where the humans are the center of everything. And then I'm starting to ask like, why don't we put everything else that makes us humans and make us Pacific Islanders in the center? Because if we lose everything else, who are we going to be? Like, because it's the environment, it's everything. It's a relationship with the environment that makes us who we are. So when we lose the environment, what do we become of that loss, And so that sort of encourages like not only for us to look into just climate change as a global issue, but look at like what can we do as Pacific Island communities, as Pacific Island people, to conserve our environment, our resources, so that we can ensure that the next generation gets to know that, okay, we are from this place, I am from Gilbertese, this is what I practice in relation to my environment, and it's the environment that surrounds me that helps define my identity.
Thank you. I want to chime in as well. I really appreciate all the points that is being said. I also agree that we also have to look into our legends and our stories of our people. We are ocean people. Migration is not something that is new to us. In fact, there are stories even before us that tells of how we move from places to places because of the environment that we are in. Who we are is the relationship that we have with one another. Wherever we go, wherever we settle, wherever we find a new home. I like to continue to have that conversation with my youth in making them realize that they come from a wonderful background of culture and tradition that holds them in places that they find lost. So when I talk about protocols, we are spiritual people. I also emphasize on that to remind us that in honoring our ancestors, our maker, we are uplifting that spiritual relationship that we also have with one another. In honoring the land that we call home, it's also in correlation with the relationship of honoring each other and the ocean, because we live and sustain from both the land and the ocean. So in all the things that, words that you all said in this space, I thank you and uplift it as well, because it is in honoring of our ancestor and ourselves and where we are today, we are learning to move forward to be able to survive. We are resilient people, and I believe that whatever comes our way, we will find a way to survive it. And the next generation need to hear that, and they need to take hold of it to be strengthened. I don't know, I talked too much already.
No, thank you, Mama Ino. Thank you. So we have one question for everyone. What impacts are you seeing, social, emotional, or cultural, for communities that are being displaced because of climate change and rising sea levels? So anyone can answer.
Okay, I'll go first. I think in the Pacific, there are a few communities, especially in Fiji, that have been relocated as a result of climate change. And I think the whole discussion around displacement has not really been extensively articulated from the communities, because these relocations were planned and they were facilitated by the government. And these communities are actually being relocated within their own land territory. So it doesn't really present challenges as opposed to, for example, a community that may be relocated or displaced from Kiribati or Tuvalu. However, there is constant sort of fear of loss, of being or inevitably being relocated in the future as a result of sea level rise. And a lot of countries like Tuvalu, especially, and the Marshall Islands, has really dismissed this whole discussion or narratives on relocation as an option to their people. I know the current government of Kiribati has been working on a different policy, looking at empowering its own people to build better, to be able to minimize climate change impacts that they're currently experiencing as a country.
Okay. So if we have no other responses, our next question. Question for everyone again. Wait, that question got repeated. Sorry. Okay, we have a question for Mama Ino from Vince Diaz. One question for you. Oh, sorry, I'm doing this. I'm sorry, I'm not sure where the question is in Vince. But while we're fixing that question, I actually wanted to bring up two concepts, slow violence and wastelanding. Have any of you heard about those concepts? No? Those concepts look at climate change and environmental damages in the Pacific, and it's kind of a moderating tool for how we're measuring the damage that is done over time. So for specifics, like the Marshall Islands, the nuclear testing that was done on the atolls there, soil violence speaks to the cancer rates and the issues that are still occurring in those areas. And then also wastelanding looks at specific locations that are under threat from climate change and speaks to the migration of those peoples as well. Those two concepts are super interesting and they cross over really well with all of your guys' work. Okay, so we fixed this. A question for you, Mama Ino, about the specific terms of traveling for COFA people. People often mistake COFA folks in the States as immigrants, but they aren't, in the sense that they get to travel to the US by virtue of a compact, which is like a treaty, because of how the US wants to travel and benefit from the FSM's territory. In this sense, COFA citizens are different from typical immigrants. In your experiences living in Hawaii, does this difference matter that your presence in the US is governed by the compact that gives you entitlements as negotiated by the leaders?
Wow, Diaz, Vincent Diaz, thank you very much for that question. Indeed, the difference is very hard to talk about. We are not immigrants, we are migrants, and those are always confused, especially with us in Hawaii, because they don't understand about the treaty that we have with the United States. Like, I don't need to have a green card to go in and out of the United States, whereas immigrants, they have to have some kind of green card, or they have to, their stay in the United States is different from us. We have no limitation, and that's because the United States is given the whole measure of the land and the ocean, which is equivalent to the United States, to be able to utilize for military purpose on our islands. And so our people in Hawaii, sometimes they're misunderstood that our stay in Hawaii is that we just come here to keep taking all the services and taking everything and don't even have anything to give back. But we have so much that we sacrifice for our own nation to be able to have this relationship to the United States, to come to their shores so that we can be able to access, especially medical. And there is no one in our community that will tell you that they will rather leave home if they have any choices, if the health care is there for our people, and if the infrastructure was really put in place. Nobody will want to leave home because they can live and survive just as well as they come out to the United States. But time is different. Time is different now. Everything is depending on money and education and health that they need to survive. They have to migrate to all these places. And so what are the stories of our people in making those choices to leave home? We continue to ask that, and we continue to try and find spaces to uphold it. So I don't know if that answers the questions, but yeah, the relationship between United States and the COFA nation is really, really unique in a sense that we don't need to have a green card in order to be able to come to the United States.
Thank you, Mama. Our next question comes from Hoku to everybody. In what ways are the people who remain back home most impacted by these changes? Changes like changing natural resources, community loss to the family and friends going elsewhere, things like that.
Can you repeat your question?
Of course. So in what ways are the people who remain back home most impacted by these changes? Changing natural resources, community loss due to family and friends moving elsewhere because of climate change, or other drivers like that?
Well, I can just speak to my experience. Like, everything happened so fast. The comeback of Free Association was in 1986. And then in 1986, not even long after that, people are starting to come out to the United States for assistance, right? And I was in college at that time, around 88. Oh, not really. Yeah, in 88. And within just a year from there was a change in our status that really make it hard for me to be able to continue my education, because the cost of school double from what it used to be because of the change in our status. And I felt like we it seems like we were on a race to nothing that is really understood. People are just trying to meet up with whatever is the changes that is happening in our society, and slowly values of relationship as becoming to be less valuable than to be able to go out and find a job to make the money to survive and to succeed. The idea of success also changed almost like overnight. And at the same time, television was also introduced, a different life was introduced to our people, and it's all glamorized that it's this way of life is better. I just feel like everything was on a fast pace all of a sudden, and we didn't slow down to really take in all of it to understand before it's too late, and it's like we're kind of lost, and we lost ourselves in the process. I hope that makes sense, but that's how I felt with all the changes that just happened within a short period of time. And the next thing I know, I'm on a different place. Even my arrival on Hawaii was like, this is not Hawaii. I'm looking for trees, and yet I see structures. I'm expecting to find people, playing ukulele under the coconut tree, and being in grass skirt and be similar to what I just left. But instead, I see high rises and structure all over me, and the whole environment for me is just shocking and new to me. I was mesmerized by it. At the same time, I was trying to figure out how to survive in that whole environment. As an 18-year-old coming to Hawaii, that was pretty shocking for me.
Okay, so we have one more question from Hoku. She says, thank you, Tammy, for your questions. They push me to reflect much more deeply about how we frame our work and how that frame informs what we are willing to fight for. I'm sitting with your point that if migration is considered adaptation, it is considered an adaptation solution, it forecloses other kinds of solutions that would allow islanders to remain in their homelands. I'm curious to hear from the panelists about what other kinds of solutions might be considered, imagined, or enacted if migration was taken off of the table.
I can jump in real quick. Something that I think is often overlooked is the power of how we tell stories about climate change or the need to relocate or to migrate off island. And I think a lot of the storytelling that has been shared, at least in mainstream media, is often the story that kind of flows the same way and kind of leads to the inevitable end of the story where folks have to move off island or they're facing despair and kind of worst case scenario, right? So I think a strategy with eliminating migration as the only option could be to really play up and share more of the Pacific storytelling that's happening that imagines these really radical futures where migration is not the only option, displacement is not an option, and these radical futures have Pacific leaders at negotiating tables, have Pacific leaders, doing urban planning measures that really honor Indigenous environmental knowledge and lifeways. So I think playing up and really illuminating Pacific storytelling that shares those different futures is key just to get us started, because we can't have material plans until we start to imagine differently. So that's something that's really helped me keep going and think about optimistic futures where Indigenous Pacific Islanders are in our future, they're innovative, they're leaders. So that's what I would recommend.
I'll add on to that. So from the Pacific here, I think what's been done, or at least sort of imagined, and what I probably, in my position, try to encourage my students and people that I'm involved with, especially at the national and regional level, to think about is to go back and visit, traditional knowledge of environments, We have ancestors that have lived through a lot of the natural disasters as well as environmental changes in the past, and they've been able to live through them up until now. So how can we revisit those knowledge and understanding of the environment? And I know that in terms of climate change, infrastructural development, it plays an essential role, especially for atoll nations like Tuvalu and Kiribati. And I know that Tuvalu has done land reclamation to extend, I think this was done in Funafuti, and they were able to build a couple of houses on that site. But I think one of the things that I also wanted to unpack, and just realizing that there is also capacity within Pacific Island countries to absorb their own people. We talk about Kiribati, for instance. The focus on Kiribati has always been on relocation because the islands are being slowly submerging as a result of sea level rise. But are we only referring to Tarawa? What about the other islands? And I like to bring up this Christmas Island, which is the largest atoll in the world, that people can also move to from Tarawa, which is quite populated right now. And it's still within Kiribati's borders. People still live there. It probably needs a lot of infrastructural development, but that's a solution to overcrowding, overpopulation, and perhaps communities and individuals and families being affected by sea level rise on Tarawa. And I think also just thinking about different ways, especially in terms of livelihood assets and resources, water and food security. What are some of the alternatives that can be provided or can be developed in Pacific Island countries to allow people to stay longer rather than just opting for relocation or migration as a solution or as an adaptation to the current climate change crisis being experienced?
So we have another question for Mama Ino from Tina. Mama Ino, your point that Micronesians are masters of the ocean, and yet we find ourselves, I include myself here, as beholden to and stifled by capitalism, among other unsustainable and devastating forces. Can you, as community leader, give specific examples of what Micronesians in places like Hawaii and Guam can do specifically to remember and reclaim the proud and rich indigenous traditions, spaces you just mentioned with the goal of living sustainably while residing on Kanaka Maoli and Chamorro homelands?
I believe when our elder was talking about we used to be masters of the currents, he's actually talking about Pacific Islanders as we are navigators of our oceans. You know, money was not something that, you know, part of our identity. You know, being master of the ocean, I believe is really also holding the different cultures and traditions that makes us who we are as Pacific Islanders and Micronesians. Living in Hawaii, how do I I'm not really sure what the question is. How do the leaders live without money? I don't understand the question.
I'm muted. So it's more so, as a community leader, what are some examples of places where Micronesians in Hawaii are reclaiming their proud and rich indigenous traditions, and how are they maintaining those spaces? And then also, how are they maintaining those spaces while living sustainably and then residing on Kanaka Maoli and Chamorro lands?
I'm not sure if I really know how to answer that, but I think that the practices that we have with our culture of, you know, the practice of, like what we mentioned earlier, our funerals, the practice of, you know, hosting each other to take care of each other, not based off just relationship that we just found, but also going back into our lineages, going back to our clans, and going back to our those kind of identity. You know, when you say you're from the clan of,
Oops. Sorry about that, folks. We might be having a little bit of technical difficulties. Give us 1 minute, please. Okay, we'll move to our last question. So this is for everyone again. But in terms of tourism to Pacific Islands, what are the environmental consequences that tourism unique to these islands? And how can we balance the need for tourist dollars with the need for environmental preservation and respect?
I only have strong opinions based on no research whatsoever. But I do know that, you know, there's, in talking with folks in Hawaii, and I can only speak of Hawaii, I can't speak of the other Pacific Islands. I know that when it comes to the pandemic right now, there's been such a rush and push to open up for tourism, and there's such a dependence on tourism. That there's been a huge conflict and conversation between and again, I'm still on the continent on Turtle Island, so this is me hearing from families and friends about different conversations around, yes, we need the income, and and we need the jobs, but who's being exposed and who's filling up the the hospitals are visitors who are bringing the disease to Hawaii, and then there aren't beds available for local people. And I remember early in the pandemic, I was hearing stories about how the mayor was on the beach passing out masks to the tourists on the beach, even though they were in lockdown. And the locals were the ones getting the citations. And from what I heard from Mama Ino it was actually the Micronesians and Micronesian youth who were actually getting taken to the police station. Anyway, I don't know if this answers the question, but I would love for tourists to get more information on how to take care. Like, there should be videos, there should be like information, there should like the whole when you leave Hawaii, the whole agriculture, they inspect your bags before you leave Hawaii, and I never understand what's the point. Someone else, a scientist, academic, tell me what's the point. You should be inspecting our bags when we come in, right? You should not honor system to throw the apple in the, you have that little trash can, you have to honor system throw it out. No, we need to be told not to. There has to be information, there has to be education, and tourists need to be taught respect. I mean, why are you coming to Hawaii if you don't respect the culture and the aina that you're coming here to visit? I that's my opinion, no research whatsoever, but every time I get on a plane to Hawaii, I'm like, where's the information these people need to know? Mama Ino's back.
Sorry, my computer died on me. I didn't even realize it. The battery was low and I forgot where I was.
Okay, so we had just left you off on can you as a community leader give specific examples of Micronesians in places like Hawaii, Guam, and can do specifically to remember and reclaim the proud and rich indigenous traditions and the spaces that you just mentioned, living with the goal of living sustainability on Kanaka Maoli and Chamorro lands?
Yeah, I'm really sorry. First of all, I would say that I was with a group of elders that did protocol to the Kamakamallis of Hawaii to ask permission to work together and to lift each other. And there is a saying in our language, which is honor, and it means be mindful. Lulu, so that it doesn't go beyond what is given. So that Honolulu word is also showing a relationship that was even before my generation or before my time. And it tells the stories of how we are cousins and we have relation with one another. And then if I talk about Guam, in my language, there is a word as regarding navigators when they have on their canoe, there is this this point on the canoe that is kind of like peace. They call it am. And then when our ancestors first came to Guam, they when it says, when the island was in that it says Guam. You hit the spot of Guam. And so even that, just that story alone tells me that there is a relationship that was set even before my time. And that during those times, it's not about money, but it's about them looking like each other, living off of the land, knowing how to create fire and sustain themselves from the land. Those reciprocity that they give each other when they first arrive on the islands or they come together, there was certain kind of honor and respect that makes those relationships very, very unique in itself and important. And I like to continue to say that we need to continue to uplift these stories and these legends that is part of our history in order for us to be cousins to one another and live in unity instead of trying to beat each other up for one is better than the other. It's not about that. It's about maintaining that relationship that is more important than everything else. I hope that answers the question.
That's perfect. Thank you, Mama Ino. And I'd like to take this time to thank all of our panelists and all the people that have joined us for this. Let me turn it over to Miley for our closing remarks.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Makaio, and thank you so much to all of our panelists. It's been such a powerful conversation, and we really appreciate it. Also, thanks to everyone in the audience, and a big thank you to all of our planning committee and event support, including Angela Robinson, Ane Tiolu, Tanji Vei, Makaio Kimbrough, and Hokuai Kao. And thank you also to Dean Catherine Stockton for her support, as well as our funders, the Mellon Foundation and the University of Utah's Global Learning Across the Disciplines grant from the Office of Global Engagement. So a recording of this panel, as well as all the others in our series, will be posted on our YouTube page. You can find the link to that in the chat. And then before everyone goes, there's just a few other announcements. So first, let me pull up so the symposium continues tomorrow. And we hope to see some of you back again tomorrow if you're able. We'll have 2 more panels focusing on issues of education and health. And they'll also be at the first one at 1 p.m. and then the second one at 3 p.m. Mountain Time. The Zoom link for these next events is the same as the one that you used to access this event today. So you can just sign in again with the same link that you received when you registered. And you can see our website for more information. Then we have 2 other Pacific Island Studies programs here at the University of Utah under the leadership of Dr. Kehaulani Vaughn and the work of Moana Uluave Haufoka to make sure that you know about. So the first is the Pacifica webinar series, which is archived on YouTube as well. And the next event, which in that series will also be hosted on Zoom, and it's Friday, April 23rd at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. And it'll be a talk by Dr. Tina Delisle, who I think was here today and asked a great question from the University of Minnesota. And so you can find more on that talk, on that series on our Facebook and Instagram pages, which I think are also getting linked to in the chat. And then the second program is the Pacifica Scholars Institute. So this program is for any of you who are or who know Pacific Islander graduating seniors or transfer students interested in attending the University of Utah. This is a 5-day intensive program aimed at preparing students interested in Pacific Island studies and higher education, culture and community-based leadership and learning. This year, it will be held June 7th to 11th. I believe it's entirely online, and applications are due May 28th. So the link to that application is also in the chat. And finally, for any Pacific Islander artists in Utah, please check out the Harvard Oceanic Collections Engagement Fellowship, which is this really cool opportunity offering funding for Pacific Islander artists who live in Utah to work with the Harvard Peabody Museum's Oceanic Collections. And there's also a link to that in our chat as well. And yeah, so with that, that's all we had for today. Thank you so much again, everyone, for joining us. And we hope to see you again tomorrow. Bye.